On the morning of the 8th of July, 1943, a Bahamian handyman ran through the halls of Westbourne, shouting that Sir Harry Oakes was dead. Rain was still coming down outside, the tail end of a storm that had rattled the island all night. Inside the bedroom, the body lay on a scorched bed. Someone had driven what looked like an ice pick into his skull 4 times, poured something flammable across the room, and set it alight. A Chinese folding screen beside the bed was smeared with blood and a handprint no one could immediately explain. And somebody, before or after the fire, had torn open a pillow and scattered the feathers across the body so that when the household found him, the richest man in the British Empire was lying in a ring of ash and down feathers, like something out of a ritual no one in Nassau wanted to name out loud. He was worth over $200 million. He had once controlled the second richest gold mine on Earth. He counted a former King of England as a personal friend and Nassau neighbour. And within 2 days of his death, that former king, now the Duke of Windsor, serving out the war as governor of the Bahamas, would personally intervene to keep Scotland Yard away from the case and fly in 2 Miami police detectives who had no legal authority on the island whatsoever. Within a week, the man arrested for the murder would not be a stranger. He would be Oakes's own son-in-law, married 2 months earlier to Oakes's favourite daughter, against Oakes's explicit wishes, in a ceremony Oakes had learned about only after it happened. Her name was Nancy Oakes. She was 19 years old. And by the end of that year, she would sit through a murder trial, testifying for the freedom of the man she'd married, while the international press tried to decide whether she'd married a con artist, a killer, or simply the wrong man at the wrong time in the wrong family. The case was never solved. Not officially. 70 years on, historians still argue between at least 4 competing theories, and the fingerprint evidence that convicted no one has never been fully explained. But the murder itself is really only half the story. The other half is what happens when an 18-year-old girl, raised inside more money than she could ever spend, falls for the one man her father forbids, and then has to watch her marriage become the motive in the most notorious unsolved murder in the history of the British Empire. This is the story of Sir Harry Oakes, and of the daughter who loved the man he hated. Chapter 1. The Prospector. Harry Oakes was thrown off a train at a whistle stop in northern Ontario with almost nothing in his pockets. The place was called Swastika, a name that meant nothing sinister yet. In 1911, just a small siding on a mining rail line. He was 36 years old, and by any reasonable accounting, he was a failure. He told a fellow drifter waiting near the tracks, a destitute man doing odd jobs at the station, that he was a gold prospector. The man told him that if it was gold he wanted, it was all around the place. Oakes had heard versions of that sentence for 13 years, in 13 different countries, and none of them had been true yet. He was born on the 23rd of December, 1874, in Sangerville, Maine, the son of a country lawyer. The family later moved to nearby Foxcroft so the children could get a better education, and Oakes made the most of it. He graduated from Bowdoin College with a bachelor's degree, then enrolled at Syracuse to study medicine. He never finished. In 1898, with the Klondike Gold Rush still drawing men north in the tens of thousands, Oakes left medical school and went to Alaska instead. What followed was not a story of instinct rewarded. It was 13 years of almost total failure, spread across most of the mineral-bearing world. He prospected in the Yukon during the declining years of the Klondike Rush and found nothing worth keeping. He worked as a medical assistant in frontier camps, treating frostbite because his half-finished medical training was at least good for that. He crewed on a ship bound for Australia and prospected there too, at Kalgoorlie, one of the richest gold districts on Earth, and still came away with nothing of his own. He tried New Zealand. He tried the Philippines. He tried Mexico, California, Nevada. He went to West Africa, and then to the Belgian Congo, chasing rumours, the way a man chases rumours when he has stopped being able to afford anything else. By his own later account, he was shipwrecked, at one point off the coast of Russia. None of it produced gold. All of it produced an education no classroom could have given him. How to read rock, how to recognise the kind of porphyry formation that meant something was underneath it, how to keep going after the 4th or 5th or 12th disappointment in a row. By 1911, he was back in Canada, effectively broke, riding trains he sometimes couldn't pay for. That was how he ended up thrown off at Swastika. He had heard about a geological formation east of the siding, granite that might be porphyry, the same kind of rock he'd studied without profit, in Australia and Colorado. He had $2.65 in cash. He picked up his prospecting tools and started walking. Within days, he'd found it, a weak, gold-bearing quartz vein outcropping on the south shore of a small body of water called Kirkland Lake. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of strike that made headlines. He staked it anyway, and when he ran out of money to develop it, he partnered with two brothers, Tom and George Tuff, to keep working the ground. By the end of 1912, they were pulling high-grade ore out of the earth. It was the first producing mine in what would become one of the most famous gold camps in the Western Hemisphere, and Oakes had a piece of it. It should have been the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a worse one. A dispute over the Tough Oaks operation dragged on for years and eventually pushed Oakes out of his own discovery. He walked away from the mine that had finally, after 13 years, given him something real, and started again from almost nothing in the same small mining district, convinced there was more gold underneath it than anyone had found yet. In 1918, with his mother's savings and a loan from a fellow boarder at his rooming house, Oakes financed a new operation, digging beneath Kirkland Lake itself this time, further down than anyone had bothered to go. What came up this time was gold, beyond anything he had imagined, in 13 years of failure on 4 continents. The mine was called Lake Shore. Between 1918 and 1965, it would produce more than 8 million ounces of gold, and at its peak, it was earning Oakes something in the neighborhood of $60,000 a day, a sum that in 1920s terms placed him among the richest men alive. He never forgot the years it took to get there. He also never quite stopped behaving like a man who might lose it all again tomorrow. That combination, the enormous wealth, and the prospector's permanent bracing for disaster, would define almost everything that came next. How he raised his children, how he treated the people around him, and eventually, how he ended up an ocean away from Ontario, in a British colony whose politics and whose people he understood a great deal less well than he understood rock. Chapter 2. The richest man in the empire. Harry Oakes met his wife on a cruise ship. Eunice Myrtle McIntyre was the daughter of a Sydney boarding house family, roughly half his age, and by every account, entirely unbothered by the difference. They married in Sydney on the 30th of June, 1923, less than 5 years after Lake Shore had turned Oakes from a broke ex-prospector into one of the richest men on the continent. She had grown up running a household on very little money. She was about to spend the rest of her life running one on more money than either of them could easily count. They settled first in Niagara Falls, Ontario, where Oakes bought an estate called Clark Hill in 1924 and spent 4 years rebuilding it into a 37-room Tudor mansion. The family moved in 1928. Between 1925 and 1932, Eunice gave birth to 5 children. Nancy first, then Sydney, then Shirley, then William, then Harry. Oakes, the man who had slept in mining camps and been shipwrecked off Russia, chasing gold that never came, now had a household staff. A private 9-hole golf course designed for him by one of the most sought-after course architects in North America, and more money arriving every day than most towns generated in a year. He did not become an idle rich man. That was never really available to him temperamentally. Instead, he became something closer to a one-man public works department for whatever town he happened to be living in. In Niagara Falls, during the worst years of the Depression, he funded construction projects specifically designed to put local men to work, deeded land for a public park, backed the Boy Scouts, and built the Oakes Garden Theatre, overlooking the falls, which still bears his name. He did the same thing, on a larger scale, back in Kirkland Lake, the town his mine had built, out of nothing. In 1939, King George VI made him a baronet for it, and the failed medical student who had once been kicked off a train with $2.65 in his pocket, became, formally and for the rest of his life, Sir Harry Oakes. The knighthood sat on him strangely. People who met him in these years describe a man who still dressed and talked like the prospector he had been for 13 hard years, gruff, blunt, uninterested in the social performance that usually came with a title, mixed uneasily with a man who now expected the world to defer to him, because it generally did. He had earned the money the hardest way anyone in his social circle ever had, and he never fully let anyone forget it. What eventually moved the family out of Canada wasn't the cold, or the isolation, or even the title. It was the tax bill. By the early 1930s, changes in Canadian tax law meant Oakes was giving up something close to 85% of his income to the government, a number that a man who had spent 13 years failing to find gold on 4 continents was never going to accept quietly. A Bahamian real estate developer and legislator named Harold Christie, who had been courting wealthy expatriates to the islands for years, made him an offer that solved the problem entirely. The Bahamas, as a British colony, levied no income tax at all. Christie sold Oakes on Nassau, the way he sold everyone on Nassau: sun, no taxes, and the promise that a man of Oakes' stature would effectively run the place informally. Simply by being the richest person in it, Oakes moved the family to Nassau in the mid-1930s and became, almost immediately, exactly what Christie had promised he would become. He bought thousands of acres of land on New Providence Island. He bought the British Colonial Hotel. He built himself a mansion called Westbourne, right on Cable Beach, and another retreat called the Caves, further along the coast. He financed the island's airport, backed hotel and aviation projects, meant to build up Nassau's tourism economy before tourism was really a Bahamian industry at all, and became, by the estimate of nearly everyone who wrote about the colony afterward, its wealthiest, most powerful, and most consequential resident. Christie became his closest friend and most trusted business partner on the island, the man who had lured him there, and the man who would, several years later, be the last person known to have seen him alive. It was a small, insular, deeply stratified colonial society, the kind of place where a handful of white businessmen effectively ran a black-majority island through the House of Assembly, and a private club culture that outsiders rarely broke into. Oakes did not entirely fit even there. He had earned his fortune with his hands, not inherited it, and the old Bay Street families, who controlled Nassau's polite society, were never quite sure what to make of a man who had been kicked off freight trains for being broke. But money of that scale buys its way past most reservations, and by the time the Second World War began, Oakes' standing in Nassau was unquestioned. So, in 1940, was the standing of the new governor sent out to preside over the colony. A former King of England, recently abdicated, recently married to the woman he'd given up the throne for, and in need of somewhere far enough from London that his presence wouldn't be a daily embarrassment to the crown. The Duke of Windsor arrived in Nassau, needing an ally with money and local standing. He found one waiting for him at Westbourne. Into this world, son, no taxes, a duke for a governor, and a father who trusted almost no one outside his own family. 5 children were growing up. The eldest of them, a headstrong girl named Nancy, was about to become the one member of the family whose choices Harry Oakes could not control at all. Chapter 3. Nancy and the Count. Nancy Oakes did not grow up close to her parents, and she said so herself, later, without much sentimentality about it. She had been shipped between schools in England, Switzerland, and New York, dragged along on her father's travels to South America, Australia, and Indonesia, and raised by 2 people she described as domineering. She was intelligent, restless, and by 17, already fluent in the particular unhappiness of a girl who has been given every material thing except the feeling of being truly seen by the people raising her. Alfred de Marigny arrived in her life looking like an answer to that. He was a French Mauritian count, tall, worldly, an accomplished sailboat racer with a European accent and manners that felt, to a teenage girl, horrified by her own parents' bluntness, like a glimpse of a more sophisticated world. He was also 32 years old, twice divorced already, both times from wealthy women who had ended the marriages not long after they began. And he had a reputation around Nassau as a charming man who lived well, without any very obvious source of income. None of that mattered much to Nancy. What mattered was that he noticed her specifically and flattered her by taking a real interest in the things she cared about, including, pointedly, his own sailboat racing, which she made a point of knowing everything about before they'd properly begun. The courtship played out mostly at long distance. De Marigny travelled to New York to see her in 1942. It was there, not in Nassau, and not through any of the usual choreography of that world, that Nancy did the proposing. De Marigny accepted. There would be no grand society wedding at the family's summer place in Bar Harbor, the kind of event Harry Oakes would have expected for his eldest daughter. Instead, the day after Nancy turned 18, the two of them eloped quietly in New York City. When Lady Eunice Oakes got the news at the family's summer home, she collapsed. Harry Oakes's reaction was, if anything, worse, and it lasted longer. He had disliked de Marigny from the moment the man appeared in his daughter's life, and the elopement did nothing to soften that. Everything about de Marigny read, to Oakes, as a warning sign he recognized instinctively, because he had spent his whole adult life around men chasing other people's money. Here was a twice-divorced foreign count, considerably older than his teenage bride, unemployed, living well without any income anyone could point to, who had now married into one of the largest fortunes in the British Empire without asking anyone's permission. Oakes had built everything he owned, with his own hands, over 13 brutal years. He was not inclined to watch it get absorbed by a man who, as far as he could tell, had never worked a day in his life. He gave the couple money anyway, at first, the way a father does, even when he's furious, $10,000 toward getting them started. De Marigny, in what may have been a genuine gesture, or a calculated one, offered to give it back. He said he preferred to support his bride himself. Whether Oakes believed that or not, the money and the gesture did nothing to bridge the real distance between the two men. They were not going to like each other. The only question was how much damage the dislike would eventually do. For a while, it looked almost survivable. Nancy and Freddie went to Mexico City after the wedding, and what should have been a honeymoon turned into a genuine medical crisis. Nancy came down with typhoid and a severe case of trench mouth, sick enough that her parents flew down to be with her. Whatever Oakes thought of his new son-in-law, he watched de Marigny show up at the hospital every day, twice giving blood himself for transfusions to keep his wife alive. It was, briefly, the kind of crisis that can either destroy a fragile new marriage or cement it. For Nancy and Freddie, for a short time, it seemed to cement it. It didn't last. Not long afterward, in Miami, Nancy told her mother she was pregnant. On her doctor's advice, given how weakened she still was from the illness in Mexico, the pregnancy was terminated. It was this, more than the elopement itself, that seems to have finally ended whatever tolerance Harry Oakes had left. He forbade de Marigny from his house entirely. Around the same time, he and Eunice quietly changed their wills. By that spring, Nancy had left Nassau and enrolled at Bennington College in Vermont, a considerable physical and emotional distance from both her husband and her father. She was 19 years old, married to a man her family despised, estranged in practical terms from the household she'd grown up in, and entirely unaware that within a matter of months, the argument over her marriage would become the central piece of evidence in the most sensational murder case the British Empire had seen in decades. Chapter 4. The Man Who Brought Him There. Harold Christie was born in Nassau in 1896, the eldest of 4 children, into a family that by his own later account had almost nothing. That fact mattered a great deal to him for the rest of his life, because it made everything that came afterward feel earned. He served in the Royal Flying Corps, in Canada, during the First World War, drifted for a time afterward, working as a journalist in Albany, New York, and then, in 1922, came home to Nassau and opened a small real estate office with his brother Frank. There was no obvious reason, at that moment, to think H.G. Christie Limited would become anything more than one more modest business on a small colonial island nobody in the wider world thought much about. Christie had a gift, though, And it wasn't really for selling property, so much as for selling Nassau itself. He understood, earlier than almost anyone else on the island, that the Bahamas could be marketed to the wealthy of North America and Europe as something more than a sleepy former rum-running outpost, a tax haven, a winter retreat, a blank canvas where old money and new money alike could build exactly the kind of life the mainland's rules made difficult. Through the 1920s and 30s, he crossed the Atlantic and the American mainland constantly, courting investors, and he brought back an extraordinary list of them: industrialists, financiers, European nobility looking for somewhere quiet to keep their money. Among them, eventually, was a broke-turned-rich Canadian gold miner named Harry Oakes. Drowning in an 85% tax bill and looking for exactly the kind of escape Christie was in the business of providing. By the time Oakes arrived, Christie was no longer simply a real estate agent. He'd been elected to the Bahamian House of Assembly in 1927. One of the founding members of the small clique of white businessmen the local press had taken to calling the Bay Street Boys, men whose fortunes and whose votes ran the colony with almost no accountability to the black majority who lived under their rule. He co-founded Bahamas Airways with Oakes in the mid-1930s. He developed some of the most exclusive stretches of coastline in the islands. He built, in short, an entire colonial economy that depended on rich men wanting to be there, and no rich man mattered more to that economy than Harry Oakes, the wealthiest resident he had ever landed. The two men became genuinely close, not merely business partners. They spent, by Christie's own account at trial, something close to half of Oakes's time on the island in each other's company, which is what made the night of the 7th of July, 1943, so unusual only in hindsight. Christie, staying over at Westbourne, wasn't strange at all. It was, by then, closer to routine. What was strange, and what has never stopped being strange in the 8 decades since, is what Christie said happened after that, and how completely his own account failed to survive contact with the physical layout of the house he claimed to have slept peacefully inside. Chapter 5. The Murder. The storm that hit Nassau on the night of the 7th of July, 1943, was one of the worst of the season, the kind of tropical downpour that rattles shutters and drowns out almost everything else. At Westbourne, Harry Oakes's mansion on Cable Beach, it provided cover for whatever happened next, and possibly an explanation for why no one heard it happen at all. The household that night was smaller than usual. Eunice and the 3 boys were away in Bar Harbor, Maine, for the summer. Nancy was in Vermont, at Bennington. Shirley was away as well. Alfred de Marigny, still legally married to Nancy, and still legally forbidden from his father-in-law's house, was elsewhere in Nassau that evening, hosting 2 dinner guests of his own before driving them home. Oakes had entertained a small dinner party too, and afterward, with the rain coming down hard, his guest of honour and closest friend on the island, Harold Christie, agreed to stay the night rather than drive back into the storm. Christie took a bedroom down the hall, not 20 feet from Oakes' own. The rest of the staff had been sent home, or to separate quarters. By the time the last light went out at Westbourne, only 2 men remained under that roof. Sometime before midnight, someone came into Oakes' bedroom and struck him in the head 4 times with a narrow, pointed object, driven in hard enough to pierce the skull in 4 distinct places. A mosquito net hung, suspended over the bed, on a metal frame. Whoever did this left the frame standing, but empty, the netting itself gone. Whoever it was then doused the room, and very possibly the body itself, with a flammable liquid, by some accounts, drawn from an insecticide sprayer kept in the house, and set it alight. Before or during the fire, a pillow was torn open, and its feathers scattered across the bed and the body. Whether to help the fire catch, or to obscure something else entirely, nobody has ever definitively explained. A Chinese folding screen near the bed ended up smeared with blood and handprints that would become the case's most argued over piece of evidence. The storm outside, ironically, may have been the thing that kept Westbourne from burning to the ground. Rain blowing in through an open window helped douse the flames before they consumed the room entirely, leaving the body burned but, the evidence around it, however contaminated, still standing. Christie's account of that night is the first thing anyone has to take on faith, and it has never entirely held up. He said he slept through all of it, undisturbed, in a room a few strides down the hall, while his closest friend was beaten, burned, and left to smoulder under a rain of feathers. Around 7 the next morning, Christie is the one who found the body and raised the alarm, telephoning for help in what witnesses described as a state of real shock. By his telling, he had no idea anything was wrong until he walked in and saw it. Investigators and biographers picking over the case in the decades since have never been able to fully square that story with the physical layout of the house, the violence of the attack, or the ordinary human likelihood of sleeping through it. There were even reports, never fully substantiated, that the Bahamian police commissioner had seen Oak's own car stopped at a Nassau traffic light late that night, driven by someone other than Oak's, though nothing conclusive ever came of the sighting. Word moved through Nassau, and then through the wire services. Within hours, this was not simply a wealthy man found dead in his home. This was the richest resident of a British colony, a man worth something in the neighbourhood of $200 million. A personal friend of the acting governor, killed in a manner gruesome and strange enough that the first rumours reaching the street had nothing to do with robbery or business rivals at all. People spoke of ritual, of obeah, of the kind of violence nobody wanted to attach to a plausible human motive, because a plausible human motive meant looking at people close to the family instead. The governor of the Bahamas at the time was Edward, Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII, sent to the colony after his abdication, specifically because London wanted him somewhere quiet and far away. Oakes was one of the wealthiest men in his jurisdiction and a personal friend. Within hours of the body being found, the Duke made a decision that would shape the entire rest of the case. Rather than call in Scotland Yard, the standard procedure for a murder of this magnitude in a British colony, he telephoned Miami and asked for 2 homicide detectives he knew personally, neither of whom had any legal authority whatsoever outside the state of Florida. Nobody at that point knew who had killed Harry Oakes, or why. What is clear, looking back, is that within the first 24 hours, the 2 men best positioned to know what actually happened in that bedroom, Harold Christie, who said he'd slept through it, and the Duke of Windsor, who was about to take personal control of the investigation, had already begun shaping the story before a single piece of physical evidence had been properly examined. And 600 miles away in Vermont, a 19-year-old girl was about to get a phone call that would end her marriage, consume the next 5 months of her life, and turn her into one of the most photographed young women in the world for reasons that had nothing to do with anything she had done. Chapter 6. The Frame. Captain Edward Melchin was blunt with the Duke of Windsor almost as soon as he landed. "Face up to it," he told him. "This is no suicide." It was, in its way, the only useful thing either Miami detective would say for the rest of the investigation. Melchin and his partner, Captain James Barker, were not homicide specialists in the sense the case actually required. They were Miami police officers the Duke happened to know personally from his own trips to Florida, brought in specifically because bringing detectives from London was impractical in wartime, and because the Duke, by his own account, didn't trust the competence of the local Bahamian force. Neither man had any legal jurisdiction in a British colony. Neither man, it turned out, had even remembered to pack a proper fingerprint camera before flying out. What they had instead was a working theory formed within hours of arrival, and a great deal of confidence in it. The theory settled almost immediately on Alfred de Marigny. On paper, it wasn't an unreasonable place to start. De Marigny had a public, well-documented feud with his father-in-law, one bitter enough that the 2 men hadn't spoken in months. He was, by his own later admission, in the general vicinity of Westbourne on the night of the murder, having driven 2 dinner guests home to a house barely 100 yards from Oak's mansion. He was effectively broke, twice divorced already, and had married a teenage heiress against her parents' explicit wishes, which gave the detectives a motive that required no imagination at all: money, and the promise of a great deal more of it once his wife's inheritance came through. When investigators examined him, they found what looked like singed hairs on his arms, which they took as evidence he'd been close to the fire that consumed part of Oakes's bedroom. De Marigny said, "The singeing had come from lighting cigars and from cooking. Ordinary domestic explanations for ordinary domestic burns." Nobody investigating him at that point was inclined to believe the ordinary explanation. Within 36 hours of arriving in Nassau, Melchin and Barker had de Marigny arrested and charged. What came next is the part of the case that has kept historians arguing for 80 years. The detective's central piece of physical evidence was a fingerprint, supposedly de Marigny's, lifted from the Chinese lacquered screen, standing beside Oakes's bed. The same screen that had been smeared with blood and handprints the morning the body was found. It was presented as the thing that placed de Marigny in the room. There was, on its face, nothing else quite like it, except the print had not turned up right away. It surfaced only after de Marigny had already been in police custody for several hours, and only after the Duke of Windsor himself had gone to the station and spoken privately with the two detectives. Barker, at trial, could not say exactly where on the screen he had found it. Melchin, under questioning, claimed he hadn't even known about the print's existence until days later, directly contradicting his partner, and the physical evidence itself didn't hold up. The material Barker said he'd used to lift the print was the wrong kind for the job. A substance that would have destroyed a genuine latent print rather than preserved it. When the defense examined the photographic record more closely, the background pattern, visible around the print, didn't match the surface of the screen at all. It matched something smooth and clean, more consistent with a drinking glass or a cigarette packet. Something, in other words, that de Marigny had actually touched during his hours of police questioning, which the detectives could then have quietly transferred onto the screen afterward. The rest of the crime scene handling was no better. The two men supposedly leading a fingerprint-based investigation left large numbers of prints at the scene entirely unprocessed. They allowed prominent local residents to walk through Oakes' bedroom in the hours after the body was found, with no effort made to stop people from handling objects at what was, by any definition, an active murder scene. Photographic plates taken of the scene's various handprints were ruined by exposure to light before they could be properly developed. It was less a forensic investigation than an improvisation, conducted by two out-of-jurisdiction police officers who had arrived at a theory of the crime before they had finished examining the room where it happened. None of this stopped the arrest from becoming international news within hours. A British colonial governor, who happened to be a former king, a murdered gold baron worth $200 million, a foreign count accused of killing his own father-in-law over an inheritance. The war was still on, and for a few weeks that autumn, the fighting in Europe and the Pacific shared front-page space with a fingerprint that may not have existed where anyone said it did. Nancy Oakes, 19 years old and still enrolled at Bennington College in Vermont, got the news of her husband's arrest by wire. She did not, for a moment, believe he had done it. She left school, came south, and began doing something almost nobody expected from a teenage heiress raised to be decorative rather than useful. She hired a leading barrister, brought in an American investigator to check the Miami detective's work line by line, and set about proving, in open court, that her father's murder had been pinned on her husband with evidence that would not survive serious scrutiny. Chapter 7. The Trial. Nancy Oakes did not wait to be told what to do. She hired Raymond Schindler, one of the most prominent private investigators in America, to take the Miami detective's case apart piece by piece, and she retained Godfrey Higgs, a well-regarded Bahamian barrister, to defend her husband in court. Her own mother believed de Marigny was guilty. Nancy spent her father's money defending the man accused of killing him, and she did it in full public view, with the world's press watching. The trial opened on the 18th of October, 1943, in a tiny packed Nassau courtroom, and it very quickly became less a murder trial than a referendum on the competence and the honesty of the two men who had built the case. Harold Christie took the stand as the Crown's lead witness and reminded the court how close he and Oakes had been, how they'd spent something like half their time together whenever Oakes was on the island. What he could not do, under repeated questioning, was offer a satisfying answer for how the sounds of his closest friend, being bludgeoned and set on fire, in a room only a short distance from his own, had failed to wake him at all. Higgs saved his sharpest work for Captain Barker. He got Barker to admit that a private interview with de Marigny had taken place before the fingerprint was supposedly discovered on the Chinese screen, which meant de Marigny's fingerprint had every opportunity to end up on something ordinary, a glass, a cigarette packet, before it ever reached the screen at all. Barker could not explain 3 curious circular marks visible on the photograph of the lifted print, marks inconsistent with the lacquered surface he claimed it came from. By the time Higgs was done, he stood in front of the jury and said plainly what the defense had been building toward for weeks, that Barker and Melchin had fabricated the evidence themselves. For personal advancement and the notoriety of solving the most famous murder of the war, it was, as more than one observer in the courtroom noted, a genuinely dangerous accusation to make. If the jury didn't believe it, de Marigny was headed for the gallows. Watching all of this from the press gallery was a mystery writer named Early Stanley Gardner, sent down to cover the trial for a newspaper syndicate. He would later call the Crown's closing address one of the most masterful pieces of courtroom oratory he'd ever heard, delivered by the prosecutor with a flourish of Shakespeare thrown in for good measure. Gardner covered the case gavel to gavel, and the experience of watching a circumstantial forensic case get dismantled on cross-examination stayed with him long enough to shape the detective fiction he built his career on afterward. Within a decade, the courtroom tactics he'd studied in that tiny Nassau courtroom had found their way, transformed, into a fictional defense lawyer named Perry Mason. De Marigny took the stand in his own defense, a considerable risk given how unpopular he already was with much of Nassau's white establishment, who found his manner arrogant and his contempt for colonial propriety barely concealed. But it was Nancy who closed the case, and by every account, she did it with a sense of theatre her family's money had clearly afforded her the schooling for. She testified, with a fever still on her, over her own mother's open belief that her husband was guilty, and she made, in the words of the reporters covering it, a considerable impression on the jury, aided not a little by a carefully chosen wardrobe she'd worn through the entire proceeding. At one point giving evidence, she appeared almost to faint. Later, during the Attorney General's closing remarks, she stood up and walked out of the courtroom entirely, telling reporters afterward she could not bear to sit and listen to such filthy things being said about her husband. The jury went out and came back in under 2 hours. The verdict was not guilty, by a margin of 9-3, a result that set off wild celebrations in the street, outside the courthouse, where a largely black crowd, who had watched the trial with no particular love for either Oakes or the colonial elite arrayed against de Marigny, lifted him onto their shoulders and carried him through the crowd. Almost lost in the noise was a second thing the jury had done on its way out the door, added a recommendation, unanimous among the all-white jury, that de Marigny be deported from the Bahamas as an undesirable alien, regardless of the verdict. It stuck. 4 days after being cleared of murdering his father-in-law, de Marigny found himself the subject of an Executive Council order, approved by the Duke of Windsor's administration, banishing him from the colony entirely, a manoeuvre his supporters saw for exactly what it looked like, a second punishment handed down after the first had failed, a kind of double jeopardy dressed up in immigration paperwork. De Marigny, never a diplomat, had not helped his own case with the Duke beforehand, having once described him publicly as a pimple on a certain part of the empire's anatomy. Whatever genuine concerns the colonial authorities had about his character, and there were some, the timing of the deportation made it hard for almost anyone to see it as anything but retaliation for an acquittal the establishment hadn't wanted. Nancy followed her husband into exile, rather than staying behind in the world her father's murder had made her heir to. Their first stop was Cuba, at the home of a friend of de Marigny's, named Ernest Hemingway. It was, on paper, a happy ending. An innocent man cleared, a loyal wife vindicated for standing by him, both of them starting over somewhere the Duke of Windsor's reach didn't extend. It would not last. The marriage that had survived a murder trial, a public scandal, and the loss of Nancy's father would not survive very much of what came after it. Chapter 8. Aftermath. The marriage that had survived a murder trial did not survive very much peace. Freddie and Nancy settled in Cuba after the deportation, staying at first with Ernest Hemingway. But the pressure that had briefly fused them together, a father-in-law's hatred, an arrest, a fight for his life in open court, evaporated once there was nothing left to fight. They separated in 1945. The marriage was formally annulled in New York in 1949. De Marigny moved on to Canada, served briefly in the Canadian Army, and then was deported from that country too, drifting from place to place for the rest of his life, before eventually settling in Houston, Texas, where he died in 1998, still publicly insisting, decades on, that he had never touched his father-in-law. Nancy did not spend the rest of her life defined by the trial, though the world around her never entirely let her forget it. She married twice more, in 1952, to a Baltic aristocrat named Baron Ernst von Hoyningen-Huene, a marriage that produced a son and ended in divorce 4 years later. And later, in 1962, to a man named Patrick Tritton. In between, she had a long relationship with the British actor Richard Greene and a daughter with him, who would grow up to marry, of all people, a son of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Nancy Oakes von Hoyningen-Huene died in 2005, in her early 80s, having outlived nearly everyone directly involved in the case that made her famous at 19. What she did not outlive, at least not by much, was her own family. The Oakes children, 5 of them, had been marked from childhood by a fortune vast enough to insulate them from almost everything, except each other's fates. And those fates were unusually hard. Sidney, the eldest son, inherited his father's baronetcy at 16 and died in a car accident at 39. William Pitt Oakes died of an overdose at 28, after several difficult years. Shirley, the younger daughter, was left in a coma by a car crash in 1981 that she never recovered from in any meaningful sense. Of the 5 children raised inside the walls of Westbourne and the family's other estates, only the youngest son built anything resembling an ordinary long life. Their mother, Eunice, who had collapsed at the news of Nancy's elopement and lost her husband to a murderer who was never convicted, lived on until 1981, watching most of her children's lives end early and badly. The murder itself has never been solved, not in any sense a court or a historian would accept as final, and in the 80-plus years since, the case has generated theories enough to fill entire shelves. Some point to the American mob. Meyer Lansky and Charles Lucky Luciano wanted casino gambling brought to Nassau, and Oakes, by most accounts, stood firmly against it. One version of that theory holds that Lansky sent men to rough Oakes up over his refusal, and that the beating went further than intended. Some point instead to Axel Wenner-Gren, a Swedish industrialist and friend of both Oakes and the Duke of Windsor, widely suspected of Nazi sympathies and of running money through a Mexican bank. In this version, Oakes had either discovered something dangerous about Wenner-Gren's wartime dealings, or was himself preparing to move his fortune out of the British Bahamas to Mexico, a step that would have devastated Harold Christie and the small circle of Bay Street businessmen whose fortunes depended on Oakes staying exactly where he was. That last detail is what makes the theory implicating Christie himself, or the wider Bay Street establishment he represented, so persistent. Christie was the one who lured Oakes to Nassau in the first place, the one who profited most from his presence, the one sleeping a few dozen feet away, the night of the murder, and the one who could never adequately explain how he'd slept through it. A Nassau newspaper editor, writing decades later, argued the murder was a strictly local affair, orchestrated by wealthy white Nassau to keep Oakes and his money from leaving, with the Duke of Windsor's importation of 2 incompetent, possibly compromised, Miami detectives serving less as a bungled investigation than a deliberate one. And there remain those who never accepted the jury's verdict at all, who still believed de Marigny did it, whatever the state of the fingerprint evidence, on the theory that a man who married an heiress against her father's wishes, and was then cut off financially and personally, had motive enough regardless of how the Crown's case fell apart in cross-examination. No one has ever been retried. No new suspect has ever been formally charged. The case remains, by design or by accident, of a badly bungled investigation, permanently open, which is perhaps the only verdict the facts will ever fully support. Chapter 9. What the Money Couldn't Buy. There is a version of this story that ends with Harry Oakes as a cautionary tale about wealth without protection, a man who spent 13 years failing to find gold on 4 continents, finally found more of it than almost anyone alive, and discovered that money bought him a title, an airport, a golf course, and a duke for a neighbour, but nothing that could keep him safe in his own bedroom. That version is true as far as it goes. It just isn't the whole story. The more interesting failure belongs to what the fortune did to the people who inherited it, rather than to the man who made it. Oakes spent his own youth with almost nothing, sleeping in mining camps, treating frostbite for pocket money, failing in country after country, until he was nearly 40. His children spent their entire childhoods on the other side of that experience entirely, raised inside a wealth so total it left them, by every account, less equipped for the world than their father had been at their age with nothing at all. Nancy grew up surrounded by more money than she could spend, and less genuine attention from her parents than she needed, and she found, in a twice-divorced foreign count her father despised on sight, the first person who seemed to want her, rather than her name. Whether that reading of de Marigny was ever fair to him is a separate question. It was certainly fair to what Nancy was missing. What's left, looking back across the whole family, is a strange kind of symmetry. The father, who clawed his way up from nothing, died violently, in the safest, most guarded house he ever owned. 3 of his 5 children died young, or were destroyed by accidents that never should have ended lives, that had every material advantage arranged around them from birth. And the one child who was closest to the centre of the tragedy, who fought publicly and successfully for her husband's life in a courtroom the whole world was watching, spent the rest of her long life quietly. 3 more marriages, a daughter, grandchildren, largely out of the headlines that had made her famous at 19. She, of everyone in that family, may have been the one who came closest to getting away clean. The house at Westbourne still stands on Cable Beach today. The Chinese screen is gone. The fingerprint that was never quite where anyone said it was has never resurfaced. And the man who once stood at the mouth of a flooded mine in Colorado felt like a fool and kept the claim anyway, is remembered now less for the 8 million ounces of gold his mine eventually produced than for 4 wounds in his skull that no one has ever been convicted of making.